And now I'm in the Scottish Parliament and I'm talking to Alasdair Allan, the member of the Scottish Parliament for the SNP for h-Eileanan on air. Alasdair, welcome to the programme.
Thank you very much, nice to see you again.
Yeah, this is my first time meeting you. We've done 2 phone interviews. Alasdair, I imagine that you're very proud to be a MSP for the h-Eileanan on air, because I've never been there, but I've heard it's a beautiful area and a lot of people there still speak Scots Gaelic, don't they?
It is a very spectacular area, and it's 13 islands off the west coast of Scotland. It is one of the last communities in Scotland where there's a big proportion of the population are Gaelic speakers. There's, I'm not sure, outside the main town, Stornoway, it's probably still a majority. But it's certainly a fragile language, but it's still alive and very much so.
And you speak Scots? You speak Scots as well, don't you?
Well, I originally come from the southeast corner of the country, which is along with the east coast and other places, Ayrshire and places, is still very much Scots speaking. So that's certainly the language I grew up with around me there in the southeast of Scotland. I've lived for the last nearly 20 years in the islands, and I studied Gaelic at university, and so I'm very interested in languages.
And the Scottish Parliament is 25 years old this year, aren't you?
Yes, so the Parliament was re-convened, re-established in 1999 after a long adjournment. We'd been adjourned for 300 years, obviously, historically, we've been an independent parliament, but we were re-established as a devolved parliament within the UK. And the debate, or the constitutional debate since then, has been around should this become an independent country. So, but yeah, the parliament has definitely brought government closer to the people in Scotland. And I spent much of my youth campaigning for Scotland to have a parliament, so I feel very strongly about that. I'm not sure if there's a complete consensus in Scotland about that, but I think most people out there, certainly outside the political world, would find it difficult to imagine going back to a life without a parliamentary democracy in Scotland.
Yeah, we'll come back maybe to talk about independence in a few minutes, but there's legislation going through the Scottish Parliament, the languages bill. Could you tell me a bit more about that, please?
Yes, there's a languages bill it's just being written by the government just now, so it has just been written, so that's yet to come to Parliament, but that will look at both Gaelic language and the Scots language. I think it's important to give a wee bit of context. Until the last 40 years, the Gaelic language really had very limited, if any, place at all in the education system. There were still people 40 years ago being punished in school for speaking Gaelic in the playground. So it's quite a recent development, and there's really only been Gaelic medium schools in Scotland in any widespread way for the last 25-30 years at most. So it's growing. The big constraint is finding enough teachers who are qualified to do that, but there's certainly demand there for it to grow. So part of it will be about education, but part of it will be about Gaelic in the community as well, and there's been a lot of debate in Scotland about how we make sure that Gaelic is something that happens outside the school gates as well as inside.
Are you confident that the bill will actually be good for, say, Gaelic? I don't know much about Scots now, but for Gaelic, say, because I have heard the Irish professor Gàidhlig, I believe he was criticising what was planned recently, wasn't he?
I don't know what he said. I mean, what's there is probably limited, and I don't think anyone says it's going to magically transform the fate of the Gaelic language. But I hope that there's enough in there, for instance, to concentrate on what's being called areas of linguistic significance, I suppose Gàidhlig in Ireland, making sure that we have a language policy while it promotes Gaelic nationally, it doesn't forget the fact that there are areas, like the area I represent, where Gaelic has a particular need for support and development because it's still a community language. So I think it's about that balancing act. Whether that balancing act is right or not, obviously people can comment on, and we'll debate in Parliament and in society about it. But the legislation we've got about Gaelic just now is 25 years old. Very, very limited indeed. So I think it's about time we looked at it again.
Yeah, in Ireland everybody knows what the Gaeltacht is, but I believe in Scotland it's not as well known. Is that right? Is it?
Well, the problem with the word Gaeltacht, to give it Scottish pronunciation, same thing. Problem with the word in Scotland is that I suppose it has two distinct meanings. One is the areas where Gaelic is widely spoken, but the other meaning the word has, Gaeltacht, is the Highlands, i.e. the area where Gaelic was spoken 250 years ago. So I think that's probably why the Act that we're proposing won't use that word, because it has those two different confusing meanings. But the area that Gaelic was spoken in a couple of hundred years ago was a good half of Scotland and more. So I think hopefully the new piece of legislation will address some of these issues about Gaelic and the community Gaelic in schools, and also giving a sounder footing to the language nationally. Scotland, and indeed Britain, doesn't have any official language defined in law. English doesn't have any official status. Certainly Gaelic doesn't, so hopefully it'll clarify the role of Gaelic nationally a bit more.
And I believe these are looking somewhat at Ireland and the language planning process in Ireland, I believe, are you?
Yeah, I understand the government looked at, particularly at Ireland and at Wales, and I think they certainly looked at some of the things that are happening in the Gaeltacht in Ireland in terms of mechanisms to support the language and funding to support the language, and the connection also between the economic development of these areas and the future of the language. These are economically, in Scotland, very fragile island often communities, and there's not going to be a language if there's no people, and that brings us back to all sorts of other stuff like housing and jobs and other things too.
Yeah, we talk about independence now in a couple of minutes. I'm just wondering, like in Ireland, in Dáil Éireann and the Parliament, the main Parliament, there's pretty much good, I think, cross-party consensus on supporting the Irish language. Is the same consensus in Scotland? Because I believe it is in Wales as well, but I just don't know if the Gaelic in the Scottish Parliament is mainly an SNP kind of interest, or are the other parties as well interested in it as well? Like,
I think there's a reasonable amount of cross-party consensus. For instance, the existing law about Gaelic wasn't put in place by the SNP. It was put in place when Labour were the government in Scotland and the Lib Dems. The Conservatives historically have been, when they were, before we had a parliament, they were the government in the UK and they supported the development of Gaelic television and so on. So there's a reasonable amount of cross-party consensus. You will certainly sometimes find people on the other side of the aisle who occasionally speak out of turn and let rip about Gaelic occasionally, but I think they speak as individuals rather than for parties. As I think we maybe talked about before, the strength that Gaelic has in some ways is that it doesn't say anything about your politics. So I have lots of constituents whose first language is Gaelic who would never dream of voting for me because they support the Union. And it doesn't say anything about your religion. I have people who are Presbyterians, people who are Catholics whose first language is Gaelic living in my constituency, at different ends of the constituency. So Gaelic has some strengths in that it's not associated with a political tradition, if you like, in the way that perhaps things have turned out in Ireland. But yes, you will certainly occasionally find people in Scotland who kind of react badly to Gaelic because they think it's some kind of nationalist conspiracy, but it just isn't.
And do you have any idea when the legislation will have progressed through the Parliament?
Off the top of my head, I don't have dates for that, but it's been published and it's yet to be introduced to the Parliament, but it will be introduced to the Parliament and debated over the next few months.
Okay, we'll move on. There are Westminster elections this year. Can you give us a bit of a context of where you think the SNP stand in that Westminster election and how important this year is in the whole kind of wider debate about Scottish independence?
Well, yeah, the background to the election, the Westminster election in Scotland, is the situation that the independence campaign has reached, which is that we have a mandate in Scotland to have a referendum on independence. We have a democratic mandate. We have a pro-independence government, two parties, the SNP and the Scottish Green Party, who between them have a majority in Parliament and stood on manifestos to have a referendum. The UK government is presently saying we are not allowed to have a referendum, and this matter has been tested in the courts, but the Act of the UK Parliament that re-established the Scottish Parliament did have within it various restrictions on this place's powers. And so one of those restrictions is that the UK government has the right to say, no, you can't have a referendum on independence. So that's the predicament. The background to the independence debate is that there's somewhere in opinion polls between 45 and 50% of people support an independence, massively more than there was 20 years ago, twice as many as there were 20 years ago probably. But I think the independence campaign still has a job to do to convince more people of the case, to bring people more round to that argument. The SNP will stand on an explicitly pro-independence ticket in this election and will make the case that it's anti-democratic for the UK Parliament simply to ignore the wishes of this Parliament to have a referendum on independence.
Are you a bit worried by the opinion polls? Because I understand that in the opinion polls, even in Scotland, like Labour are getting a lot more support than they have been for a long time.
Well, the SNP have, well, not the majority, we have the biggest number of seats in this Parliament. We also have the majority of the MPs which go to represent Scotland in Westminster. We're not complacent about that. Yes, it's true to say that at the moment some of the debate is about how do we get the Tories out of government. I think our answer to that would be, well, from time to time Scotland gets rid of unelected governments through Westminster, but if we're independent we don't get any unelected governments at all. And I think that's the argument we'll be bringing to the fore, is that if you want to permanently ensure that Scotland doesn't have unelected governments, then we need to be an independent country.
Okay, Alasdair, it's great talking to you today. Are there any other areas of your work, say nationally or in your constituency, that you'd like to tell our listeners about that you'd be focusing over the rest of the year?
In terms of my constituency, the kind of things that interest people there will probably be familiar to people in rural Ireland. People are interested in crofting or small-scale agriculture. People are interested in the future of that. People are interested in the fishing industry. People are very interested in transport links, living on an island, ferries and aeroplane services. People are interested in housing in a big way. So what's one of the things I spend most time talking about is that the need for housing in rural Scotland that's affordable, and the big debate about the number of houses that are coming out of use for families and ending up as holiday homes for people, or second homes for people around rural Scotland. So I suppose I will probably be talking about all those things in the next months to come, as well as the Gaelic Bill and as well as independence and everything else.
Are you confident that the SNP will regain the seat in the Westminster seat in the Western Isles? Because I understand there's kind of a bit of controversy about who the current Member of Parliament represents.
Well, there isn't any controversy about that. He's left the SNP. So the SNP has a candidate, and we will stand and we'll fight to win that seat. It's a campaign that we are confident about, but we'll work hard to win, and we aim to win.
There we go.
No, I think we're fine, but I'm grateful for that, and thanks very much again for the chance to meet.
Well, it's great meeting now, so thanks very much.
Okay.